Tonight I'm going to be talking about grit, growth, and classical education, something I've been thinking about a lot this summer. On Tuesday, our high schoolers all are leaving for high school retreat, and during that time we have at least 5 lecture spots, where the goal of those spots is for us to introduce to the high schoolers kind of the back end of everything we do here in the high school. Like, why do we have the rules that we do? Why do we make you do this kind of homework? Why do you read these kind of books? So along with a kind of Ask Me Anything session that we do with all the faculty who are there, I give at least 4 talks, one on rules, one on pedagogy and reading, but then also just on things I think it's really important for the high schoolers to understand about how we shaped our school. This talk is an initial directed at you version of what we're going to say in a week to the high schoolers directly, depending on how it goes, I guess. So you're my guinea pig audience. A few months ago, I heard a talk that has stuck with me. After recalling an incredibly difficult, grief-stricken time in his own life, the speaker went on to talk about the therapy and counseling he received during his family's recovery, and one particular idea that I want to share with all of you. As he walked into recovery from this dark time, he was told by his psychiatrist that there are 2 psychologically recorded responses to extreme trauma. First, there's the one that we are all familiar with, post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD. PTSD first started to be talked of widely after the horrors of World War I, when soldiers started coming home with what doctors termed shell shock. In 1952, it was codified directly after World War II into the DSM-1, the Professional Handbook for Mental Disorder in its kind of first iteration, as gross stress reaction. It remained mainly focused on and demonstrated in veterans of modern wars until well after the Vietnam War, in which cases of PTSD were noticeable in returning soldiers of active and sustained combat. But more recently, psychologists have found that victims of interpersonal violence and relational violence, particularly when sexual in nature, are among those most likely to experience PTSD as well. I say all of this because I want to point out how dramatic and traumatic the events preceding true PTSD really are. They are war and rape and man-made disaster. PTSD is a dangerous and real consequence of extreme violence and loss. It's an acknowledgement of the very real effects on the brain that extreme trauma has. As spiritual beings, this makes sense. We as Christians believe we are made for a world in full communion with God, a world that was torn and broken due to sin. So now we're treading this dangerous path, being made for a heavenly country while trying to survive one in which hell keeps creeping in. But this wasn't what the speaker went on to focus on. Instead, he wanted to talk about something that I hadn't heard a psychologist, professor, or anyone talk about directly, and that was a psychologically recorded and understood term called post-traumatic growth. Post-traumatic growth is new, relatively speaking, to psychological literature. Its recognition began in the 1990s through doctors trying to understand something they routinely witnessed in some people. After great trauma, even atrocity, some people responded, sometimes after dramatic PTSD, with post-traumatic growth, a newfound health, resilience, and personal and spiritual growth that could not be understood as simple recovery. They were better than they had been before. Some people don't recover from PTSD, some people didn't, some people did. Some people recovered okay, some people throve, becoming wiser, kinder, and more understanding, with a stronger connection to the spiritual world. There's a lot of debate, even in the little I've looked into it, as to why this happens in some and not in others, and even some debate about whether it happens at all. Some psychologists don't like the literature surrounding post-traumatic growth because it's necessarily self-reported growth. I don't understand this because most of psychology and psychiatry depends on self-reported health, right? Like you feel better, so you're doing better. But that seems to be the criticism. Some would also like to make a strong clarification between post-traumatic growth and resilience. Resilience is a resistance to psychological effects of trauma. Post-traumatic growth happens after the effects happen to you too. So you suffer things like PTSD and then you grow. With post-traumatic growth, you may have felt the very depths of PTSD, but you, for some reason, didn't stay there. I say all this because I want to say something else, something that uses the relationship of these two psychological effects as an analogy that's not quite an analogy because I think it's more direct than that. Without diminishing the severity of true PTSD, I think there's a lot that we can learn from these two responses to trauma, and that can inform how we train children to respond to all sorts of hardships. I am concerned by a growing trend I see among teenagers in particular. It is, I think, a direct product of overexposure, which, man, I'm beginning to think is any exposure to the social media and blogging platforms of the internet. But it's now spreading socially, so that I see it in students who maybe didn't have extensive internet access at all. My sense is that it started most strongly in Tumblr. Tumblr is a closed blogging platform in which you have to be a fellow user in order to read what people write. It's often anonymous, with people free to build a Tumblr persona, and your feed is curated by subscription, which now many things are, but when it started that was very unusual, meaning you are entirely free to cultivate the voices from which you want to hear. It was hugely popular with my students 5 to 6 years ago, and what was unique there I now see everywhere. Platforms like Tumblr and now Instagram and others gave voice to a kind of social engagement and demand that I don't think had the ability to find a broad audience before, except in really select physical communities. The ability to curate who you heard from and who heard from you gave rise to strong voices who used platforms like these to create what was called often safe spaces, places in which they could voice extreme opinion, description, or idea of themselves, and ideas about how the world should conform to them, and curate communities in which everyone would agree. Disagree in a way that bothered anyone, and you could simply be blocked, removed, or unfollowed, or more popularly, just incessantly chastised and shamed for your harmful opinion. I got off Tumblr a long time ago, but I'm starting to see the same culture on corners of many other platforms as well, and more germane to this talk, in the lives of lots and lots of our teenagers. There's a kind of moral stance that these communities developed, one in which offending someone was the capital crime. Any challenge or question to the ideas espoused could be seen as a lack of sensitivity and require banishment. In this way, expectations were developed that any offense meant the person doing the offending should not be tolerated, and one's own feelings should not be affected, and the offender of those feelings just be removed. If they were affected, it was obviously the fault of the other person, as one's own feelings of safety and security were the paramount protected virtue of the community. We are all familiar now with how this has affected our colleges. Students seeking kind of safe spaces and sensitivity from their professors are demanding opposing voices be silenced so as not to offend, and challenging therein the very nature of what we have thought of as a classical liberal education and what it was meant to do. By seeking insulation from these differences in worldview and moral beliefs, our students are cutting themselves off from a lot of the opportunities we've always thought of as learning. But I think it's more insidious than that. That one's kind of an easy headline to abuse. I think it's trickled down into the teenage population, into a teenage population that doesn't know how to overcome hardship, and worse, for their own development, is beginning to believe that they shouldn't have to overcome hardship. We already have a problem of great privilege throughout our entire culture. In certain ways, our children, teenagers, and ourselves have a standard of living that kings and queens even 150 years ago couldn't have imagined. We can get anything we want just about any time we want it. We have what are, I think at this point, truly endless opportunities for entertainment, should we ever want it, without the exercise of even our own creativity. It's all provided for us. Even our food is really, really easy to consume, with more options available even at the most common grocery store than generations before us could have imagined. And it's really easy to get used to ease. It is easy to get used to insulation. And it's easy to fall into a trap of demanding more and more ease and insulation for ourselves and for our children, for whom we naturally want happy and comfortable environments. I feel this draw in myself a lot. I have one 18-month-old, but I don't ever want him to be mad. I don't ever want him to cry. I feel myself constantly like resisting, telling my husband, like, just give it to him, just let him do what he wants, you know? But I think that's a desire that we have to fight. And here's why. I want to begin by using a really small example, and really it was just kind of funny at the time, not particularly critical of anyone. But I once went on a cool field trip with some teenagers. At one point during the trip, we had this opportunity to climb up this famous tower. Once you climbed the interior, winding, worn stone stairs in the tower, you had a view of the surrounding countryside for as far as you could see. But of the 4 high schoolers I was with, 3 refused to go. One claimed claustrophobia, the other agoraphobia, the other was afraid of heights. Fear is real. It's always real, it's often real, and I'm not saying it isn't, but it always robs. And here, I couldn't help but think what might be somewhat minor anxieties robbed wonderful people of a perhaps once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to do something that was just kind of awesome. A minor challenge was presented, and claims that had become identity suddenly appeared. It has become normal, I think, for teenagers to identify strongly, not just with subcultures, which has been normal forever, but of subcultures of weakness or even illness. Everybody has a mental disease or incapacity of some sort, it seems, and they pop up to remove challenges, but also remove the benefits of accomplishing those challenges, sometimes just entirely fun benefits. When did it become cool to be weak, to be unable, to not be able to deal? That day, these little identified and clung to weaknesses robbed us of cool opportunities. But someday, will it rob them of more? Climbing a tower is cool, but it's unlikely to change your life. Many of life's little challenges can be accepted or foregone with little long-term consequence, but trends start to become more significant, and there is a correlating trend in academics. The SAT keeps changing its standards so that students will perform better on it. This seems like a problem to me. The very point of a national standardized exam is to hold students to a universal standard. If the standard changes to meet the ability of the students, I fail to see the point as an exam, but I also worry that our students are being lied to. The SAT has long been a poor measure of college readiness, which people pretty widely acknowledge, but at least it used to mean something. When I was going to college, if you managed a 1200 or so, you really were going to be fine. Any college would admit you. That was far above the national average, which is a totally different problem than the one we're addressing here, but it did mean something. I'm not sure that even this kind of broad statement can be made anymore. And if a standardized test adapts to the falling standards of you and your peers, but still claims to be a universal standard, you might walk away with a harmfully inflated sense of accomplishment from an exam that's just living off its past. The proliferation of electives was an early concession to students not wanting to take classes that they considered boring or irrelevant. And it trickled down from college to high school and even down to elementary school. Electives are great until they start replacing long-held hallmarks of a good education. Don't take calculus, it's hard. And you might have to work really hard, and you might still not get a good grade because it's really hard. So take consumer math, because what does that even mean? Now, I'm saying this as someone who took a class, I kid you not, called History of the Nature of Math, which was basically about nothing. And I got a B. The American Library Association famously changed the name of its Children's Literature Award this summer, removing Laura Ingalls Wilder's name due to her racial insensitivity. It is one thing to rightly identify an author who is cruel and hateful towards those who are different from them, but another to be unable to view an author in their context, reminding oneself that Wilder's views are actually pretty gentle and surprising given how little she knew of other races and how polarized her America was. In light of what we know of Wilder, this decision appears motivated by an anticipation of a possible sense of offense in the reader, rather than a consideration of the author herself. It is prioritizing the felt experience of a reader, even an experience that may come from ignorance or lack of proper distance over the true nature of the author and her work. It is a choice to try to avoid a possible subjective discomfort, or maybe even just a disagreement, even if it means foregoing something of great value. Why does this matter? I think it matters because we have a cultural zeitgeist that I think is at odds with what is best for our students' personal growth. We have a cultural, social, and academic atmosphere which is telling students to reach only so far, to avoid discomfort, to demand ease and lack of offense. And we have a fear of grades, poor results, disciplinary action, and college admissions that is asking parents to demand good marks over good work. First from the student, and then just from the teachers if the student isn't living up to what you want. And my suggestion is that this has farther reaching and more damaging effects than we are currently imagining. This is where I want us to return to the idea of post-traumatic growth. Our minds are capable of taking the deepest experience of evil, loss, violence, and improving. It takes a long time, it takes help, it takes healing, but it is possible and it happens. I think this is because this is a reflection in extreme of what our minds are meant to do every day. We are challenged, we respond to challenges well, and we improve. What happens if we break that cycle? What if we decide to remove ourselves from hardship, challenge, difference, and pain whenever we can? I'm afraid that the results on our minds and on our hearts will be disastrous. Ancient cultures around the world knew where greatness came from. The hero's quest of Beowulf, who sets out to rid a country that is not even his own of a monster that has no previous claim on him, just because he believes he can, is the kind of story that we've long told our children and our adults to show what great men do. The tales of Arthur's knights who take their strength, nobility, and privilege and put it at the service of the needy across their country became a legend so ubiquitous to Western culture because it again showed us what it means to be strong. You train yourself through minor challenges so that when the dragon's threatening, you're ready to fight. Someone trapped. I think that schools have always, by and large, considered themselves places in which part of this training naturally happens. No student was meant to come to school already knowing everything they need to be successful. Few students come in with the maturity they need to deal well with strange kids with different habits, different ways of speaking, different ideas of what's fun. Schools are places in which children learn through challenge, both minor and significant. As a school, we have wanted to lean into this with direct intention because of the days in which we live. We've made choices that are different than many in order to foster appropriate challenges of many different sorts. This summer we installed a climbing wall on our playground. It's a really simple one. It's relatively low at its highest, not higher than a lot of the trees that you can climb here. It's got really good sized grips and a large fall zone beneath it. But it is a risky element, and intentionally so. It's one in which a student can climb to the top, which means it's one from which they could fall. The reason it is there is because it's an appropriate challenge. It's the sort of things on which students must try and may fail. They may not make it to the top, and they may have to go slow, they may slip or fall. And if they want to play on it, they'll have to try again. Our property has several large oak trees that serve the same purpose, and so does kind of everything outside in Texas, honestly. As a girl who grew up near San Diego, it's kind of shocking. The heat, the rain, the fire ants, the humidity, it's all minor, optional challenges. But these things add up. Yesterday, on one of the hottest days of the year, just about every 8th and 9th grade boy braved the heat during lunch, I honestly don't think they thought about it at all, to play a big game of soccer, which is right and awesome. How sad would it be if our teenage boys were too precious to play in the sun on a hot day? When kids are bold and eager to try new things, our role as adults gets put back in its proper place of being the ones to say, hey, are you too hot? Will you sit down? Will you take a break? Will you drink some water? And that's all good, and that's all right. We have a good amount of younger boys who come in not so naturally bold. They don't want to play outside. They hate getting sweaty. They mostly want to sit around and not do much. We found that when we shoved them outdoors and gave them nothing to do except follow their whim and imaginations and bodies, they grew bolder out of necessity of entertaining themselves. It seems minor, but I know I've seen it change them. They just become people capable of having more fun, of being happier and doing more, both in the classroom and out. A similar thing is true in academics. My goal as a high school teacher is always to push, especially our juniors and seniors, to do some hard things. Our juniors read Don Quixote in its entirety this summer. Our seniors War and Peace. Foregoing other challenges in both of these works, Don Quixote is over 900 pages of hundreds-of-year-old literature originally written in a different language. War and Peace is over 1,200. This is not something that most teenagers or people of any age are inclined to do on their own. And there's good in doing it just because you have to. We assign between 20 and 30 challenging texts a year, primarily because the texts themselves are excellent and good and great and not to be missed. But there's a good that comes from just having to do the hard work of a heck of a lot of reading. Even Mr. Yee and Dr. Bartell, both accomplished readers and scholars, told me today that after finishing War and Peace for the first time, they thought, I can read anything! Dr. Bartell has a PhD in literature. There's a training of your will, a trying out of your self-discipline, a working out of a possible tendency to easy boredom that comes from doing hard academic tasks. Reading hard things is an example, but so is studying for a challenging math exam, or working through a difficult concept in physics or astronomy or chemistry. In our younger students, sometimes this might be the big, giant challenge of learning to keep track of your stuff, or cleaning up. And so Dr. Reynolds, I think, gave away a hat this morning. I may have missed it, but one of our first graders came up to me and said, I have a hat! And then walked out the door without her backpack. She just left all other possessions now that she had a hat. Nothing else needed.
That was, in fact, me.
Yeah. It may be the challenge of learning to keep track of their stuff, or cleaning up and wiping down their lunch table when what they really want to do is go outside and play. Or learning how to do what the teacher wants you to do longer than you, right now, have the patience to do it. Or the physical challenge of a climbing wall or a treehouse net and getting all the way to the top and back down again. These things seem trivial, but they add up to something very important. And there are corresponding emotional challenges that work alongside them. Any good school should not only hold a student to a standard for which they have to reach, it should also be the kind of place in which students learn an emotional and moral grit or resilience that will serve them for the rest of their lives. I believe it's our duty to help students to hear from one another, even when they have strong differences and disagreements, to experience the uncomfortable arguments that can come up even among friends, or to learn how other Christians may think and feel about church and theology and practice, even when it differs distinctly from our own in intimidating or scary ways. Schools must help raise students who see a tall tower and climb to the top because they can and because it's awesome. because that will be the very least of the challenges that are to come in their life. We cannot, through negligence, misplaced compassion, or love of ease, help our children develop into a people of easy victimhood, awash in their circumstances, eager to avoid rather than believing themselves capable of facing what's in front of them. I'm very concerned that many modern academic and social voices are asking for a kind of sheltering that does nothing but create the kind of minds that can't recover from even minor hardship and trauma, because they've never been given proper challenges, or because we have undermined the virtues of courage and patience and fortitude so completely we don't even know how to talk about them anymore, much less ask for them. And I think this is what takes us back to post-traumatic stress and post-traumatic growth. Psychiatrists say they don't know why some people have the ability to grow from trauma and some don't. Perhaps minds are just wired very differently. We know, in fact, that they are. Some people face battlefields unscathed, while most can't. Some people are resilient in the face of trauma, some are not. Some heal and some don't. But in the light of our sense of scientific unknowing, I would encourage us to look backwards. Job faces the full onslaught of the devil and grows. Jesus faces death and the harrowing of hell and trusts the Lord until he returns to his right side. Odysseus can sit in tears on foreign lands, but remain resilient when others fail, so he gets to return to his wife and son. In a more quixotic, literally example, Don Quixote faces beatings, sufferings, and deprivation because the code of the knight-errants, which he doesn't even belong to, require him to serve those more needy than himself, even at the cost of his own health and comfort. Now, on the other side, Eusebius, the church historian, notes the immediate slide into complacency and sin as soon as the Christian church experienced a relief from their persecution. I don't know what that means. It doesn't seem good for us. Perhaps these men of the past are the lucky few, whose brains were just wired the right way. Or perhaps they are those who were trained to face adversity when it comes, to be guided in hope through hard things, and to heal and grow after great loss and pain. Perhaps both. Psychiatrists might not know, but I think anyone with a sense of history or story or moral formation could have a hunch that these people don't come from some sort of miraculous vacuum. They come from careful patience and good training. They come from little things that turn into bigger things and are faced with the same understanding of themselves that comes from a history of appropriate challenge and hard work. There is, of course, a far-reaching, thank goodness, gap between the little challenges of life and the great trauma that results in the kind of psychological damage that is PTSD. But that's what makes post-traumatic growth so remarkable. If we are capable of recovering, more than recovering, growing from the worst that mankind can inflict on one another, it is a reflection of how good we could and should be at facing smaller challenges. And I think it's a reflection, along with every good story ever told and every great hero we know about, of what our souls are meant to do in a sin-ridden world. We have been made capable of great growth in the face of pain, but we might need a little practice. I believe that our schools and our families are the places in which this practice is meant to take place, where good challenges can be used to cultivate a heart of courage and resilience and recovery, and oppose a culture that would encourage us instead a weakness in us all that can only result in greater harm to anybody who embraces it. Thank you.